So that's long and short of it. We'll be talking about Bellini start talking about Bellini on Friday. Giovanni's out for the last couple of days as well, because he's a bit of a heavy hitter. There's quite a bit to talk about, right? So we left off talking about Andrea Mantegna, who you remember is not in Venice proper, but is on the mainland that's controlled by Venice, particularly in the city of Padua, right, which was part of the Veneto, or the Terra Firma, going back to 1405. And we looked on Friday at numerous works by Mantegna to get a sense of his style, and then began to look at the works at the National Gallery by Mantegna. We have two paintings that are firmly attributed to him. Both of them are fairly badly abraded. In other words, the final surface is mostly rubbed away. But they're good paintings in themselves. They're not in this pristine shape, for example, as the Saint Sebastian on your right, which I was surprised to see somebody pictures of me in front of it. It's only about like this. I've been to Vienna, but I was 20 years old, so it's been a long time, right? 25. Anyway, it was a while ago. But it kind of looms larger, doesn't it? I didn't point this out, and I have a detail of it. I didn't point it out, but you'll notice that St. Sebastian is looking toward the clouds, and one of the clouds is becoming Christ on horseback. The Savior coming to rescue him. You see that in the upper left corner? There? Right? Nice. But again, it's that hard-edged, draftsman-like quality of Mantegna's work that allows these things to, the clouds to almost turn into marble, turn into stone. Right? And then we were looking at these little infant saviors in this class down at the National Gallery, where he's swaddled in these clothes that relate back to some 14th century pictures that were local cult objects used as part of dramatic performances in church, standing in for the baby Christ at a nativity scene. And that may be why Mantegna quotes from those earlier works. But again, he's this paradox of, on one hand, being a cute, chubby baby and a very effective cute, chubby baby, and then also being very much adult in his demeanor and in his posture and in the accoutrements that he holds, from his purple royal robe to the cross that he's carrying there along a lengthy staff. Usually when Christ carries a cross on a staff like that, it's a symbol of his victory over death. And so again, when we talk about paradoxes with this work, other things come up, youth and adulthood, but also infancy and the passion, right? Because he carries something that we most often see Christ carrying at the resurrection, after he's come back from the dead. Yet here he is as an infant, right? So again, there are these sort of layers of meaning, some of which seem to almost contradict each other in Mantegna's work. But boy, don't you wish you could draw folds like that? Oh, who did? Right? We've been trying in a drawing class when I'm sitting in to draw folds, and even though they don't look particularly realistic, they're really good, right? I mean, it's almost like too tightly knitted and knotted and folded. And the way it drops over his legs, I would think looks like the cross, like a pine board, and you're looking at the xylem and phloem of a piece of wood, the wood grain, as it drapes over his leg. But he's using it correctly, right? Because you notice that as it drapes over the Christ's proper right thigh, it's more slack, or bunched up and sort of across horizontally over the thigh, and it hangs more directly vertical behind his left hand, and that in fact picks up the weight-bearing leg, doesn't it? That's using the drapery to sort of accentuate the pose. When we talk about this idea of paradoxes, of amalgams of different elements of Christ's life, we can also look at that robe that he's wearing as almost being like the winding cloth that he's buried in, eventually. Right? He's wrapped up like a mummy almost in that cloth. And one thinks about how bodies are prepared for burial, how they're wrapped up in clothing. This is before the cult of the Shroud of Turin, right? But the idea that Christ would be wrapped in a winding cloth at burial. Again, they're layering these meanings together, and it gives this simple little picture, sort of a wealth of meanings and richness of content, right? That's really quite wonderful. The more you think about it, the more there is to see. And that idea of the burial, I think on a certain level is picked up by the marbleization of the background. You get the sense of like a sarcophagus almost that he's appearing in, right? But again, it's the infant Christ. It's at his birth where, the idea of his death is unknown to anybody but him and the Virgin Mary, right? And yet Mantegna brings that out in this image that in Christ's birth there is the harbinger of his death, and in fact he was born really for that one purpose, which is to die and to conquer death, right? That's the only reason he's on the planet. Yeah, exactly. So all I got to do is stay away from sin, right? That's easy enough. There you go. Okay, that didn't work. Hang on a second. It's not. Come on. Moving my slideshow ain't slideshowing. So I'm going to hit the pause button on my. Yeah. Okay, so still should be recording this. I would take the notes today because since that happened, I don't know if the recorder's still recording that screen like it's supposed to. It should be. But just in case it's not, you may not be able to see anything. I'll put on here. So here's another Mantegna work from the National Gallery, and it's also very badly abraded, although as you can see from looking, it seems a bit more fully resolved, but like the Infant Savior, it's missing sort of the final surface of finish, which would have made the three-dimensional modeling of the face that much more sharp and three-dimensional. Would have made the three-dimensional modeling of the face more three-dimensional. This is why I should probably have notes instead, because then I wouldn't say stupid things like that. That said, I'd be happy to have drawn that. If you look at the shading under the chin and that little bit of reflected light under, you don't have a chin that looks like that, but, mine kind of just comes down. But, underneath here, there's that reflected light and then the shadow that comes. It's really sort of very closely observed, isn't it? It's really wonderfully observed portrait on Mantegna's part. And, it works quite well. We don't know who he is, and the costume puts him in a certain class of society, as does the hat, but it's not enough to sort of identify anything with any great particularity. There's quite a few people around Mantegna that have costumes very, very similar to this. But Mantegna was a first-rate portraitist, and the majority of the portraits that he did were not on individual panels like this one. Remember, we're still working on we're not working on canvas yet, right? The majority of these are on some other surface like masonite, or one on the left, or in this case, wood panel, the one on the right. And this was done, as you can see, about a decade later in his career. I got to look at my notes for the exact date on this. 1459 or so, Mantegna moves from Padua to the city of Mantua, which is just past sort of the edge of the Veneto, right? So the terra firma is controlled by Venice. It's sort of this region comes up over the Lake Garda there, right? And then sort of sweeps back along the river, like 152. And Mantua is controlled by a totally different government, right? So it's outside of the control of Venice. And in fact, the city of Mantua is controlled by a duke. So it's part of the old feudal system still. It's not a representative government like Venice has. We spent a lot of the first day talking about Venice as representative government, right? The idea that you have the council, right? You inherit your reign, but the essence of it was elected. Well, Mantua is not an elected government, it's an inherited government. And he's going there to work for the Gonzaga family. Duke Ludovico Gonzaga of Mantua and his family. And this is actually the ducal mansion in Padua, which is still there. And perhaps Mantegna's best loved work anywhere is this room called the room of pictures, the camera picta. Camera just means room. Sometimes it's called the camera degli sposi, the marriage room, for no particular reason. But Mantegna frescoed all of the walls, all 4 walls, plus the ceiling. If you look up above, the architectural elements that you see are painted, right? It's all fresco. And it's very thoroughly studied so that all of the decorative elements you see, not only the crossbars of those ribs of what appear to be the vaults, but also the putti with garlands, the Cupid-like figures, the portraits in the roundels, the scroll work, and the vines in between the ribs, the vaulting. All of that is painted. All of it is based on Mantegna's personal study of ancient Roman decorations, right? And we talked on Friday about how Mantegna is this amateur archaeologist of sorts. I'd put him even higher than amateur, except that amateur means a lover of archaeology, right? And so on the walls between, for example, the 2 landscape scenes on your left, you can see that there is this vine scroll that comes down to pilasters, and that's again all painted, right? So it's really quite effective in blurring the distinction between those elements that are 3-dimensional architectural elements, such as, for example, the art sphere is in fact that does fit under that standard, right? But you can't tell where the flat architecture is and what that came to create is. And that's really true everywhere. That's fantastic. I love on the right-hand door, we'll look at that a bit more closely. There's the Duke Ludovico. Looks like he's sitting on top of the mantelpiece of the fireplace as guests mount the stairs to climb up on top of the fireplace to talk to him. Right? And really fantastic. And these are full of portraits of various court members in Mantua, right? And reveal to us the degree to which Mantegna is a fantastic portrait. I think it's curved. I've never been to Mantua. I would love to go. My wife and I got lost driving around Venice one time. We left Venice, right? We went down to Ravenna to look at mosaics. And then we were going to go, I really wanted to go to Mantua, but she was getting sick of the way the Italians drove. And so, the horrible. And so we're on our way back to Venice. We said, we're going home. We're going back to our apartment and get out of the car and park it for the rest of the week and never leave again. And on the way back, we're on the Cause. We're coming up on the causeway that leads to the parking lot across the lagoon. We're coming around this corner, and it's separated. It's a divided highway. So there's one, we're on 2 lanes going this way. There are 2 lanes coming this way. There's this truck. We're trying to go around the outside of this truck. We're not, there's no oncoming traffic. And he starts to fade, right, as we're like right here. And so I might either lock him up or gun it. So I gunned it. Karen didn't like that. And as we got past it, and he says he's coming over without really signaling, there's a car facing us on the side of the road. I don't know how he got turned around 180. He's facing his headlights on, and it's on fire. Right? She's like, Karen just started weeping. Get me out of this car. And anyway, so I never got to Mantua. The answer is, I think it's a no. Right? The long answer is, I've never seen it myself, but I think you can kind of tell where the edge of it is even in this particular slide. Right? That's my last slide. And we'll see. I think I've got a detail looking up at this, right? If we look more closely at this wall here, we see, again, how he's opened up the room and covered really all elements of it with imagery. These 2 walls are the most famous of the 2. And I've got a detail coming up here. I think it's in this scene here, right? On the right, we see Ludovico meeting his nephew. And it's been suggested that our fellow here is this guy back here. And if you look at him, it's fairly plausible, isn't it? Right? It's in the other direction, it's all. Right? Now, it's not exact, and the nose here is a bit more, hooky, right? Sort of rounded. But you can see that the clothing that he's wearing and the hat and everything does put him sort of in this circle, doesn't it? And the date is right. It's after he's moved to Mantua. So one must assume that this is part of the court circle around the Gonzaga family. And if it's not, that means that Gonzaga gave Mantegna the go-ahead to work for somebody else, because his principal job is to be court painter to the Gonzaga family, which means they get the first dibs at whatever he does, right? So, in any event, that gives us a bit of context for this piece from his period in Mantua. So we're going to trace him, even though we're focusing on works done in Venice, we're going to follow him through the rest of his career, right, and look at some of the works that he's done while he's left that behind. Because we've got these other images that are really quite lovely. This is, we're not quite sure, he ran a large shop, Mantegna did. Numerous people making copies of his compositions. Sometimes he would make the drawing, and other artists would make the finished work. As we'll see, he was also a very prodigious printmaker as well, engraver. And he had a shop that was making also designs after his making engravings after his designs. So sometimes with his designs, they have 3 or 4 different versions of them by different people. Some by Mantegna himself, although there is some debate on that. So here is Judith and Holofernes. Does anyone know the story of Judith and Holofernes? Do you know this one? It's from, well, there are certain books of the Bible that are called the apocryphal books of the Bible. And that means that they weren't accepted by every theological source, and therefore they tend not to be in the standard Old Testament primarily that you would have normally seen. So the book of Judith is part of that. And Judith was one of the children of Israel who, during their captivity in Persia, were enslaved by the evil king of the Persians, Holofernes, right? And after they were captured, Holofernes had the Israelites paraded in front of his throne so he could review the people he had captured and subjugated, right? And as they're parading in front of his throne, he sees Judith. He says, hang on a second. You know, you're quite stunning, right? He becomes very taken with her. And her first reaction is, ew, right? Pagan king, no way, right? But then she realizes that she can use Holofernes' weakness for her beauty against him. So she agrees to marry him. And at their wedding banquet, gets him stinking drunk. So that on their wedding night, when it comes time to go to bed, he can't do anything, right? Because he's just out, right? Drink himself to sleep. And she proceeds to quickly cut off his head, thus freeing the children of Israel, right? So, what we see here is the Persian wedding tent, right? The night of their wedding, the moment after she's done this horrible deed, or wonderful deed, depending on how you look at it. You just focus on the violence, and it's horrific, but freeing the Israelites from captivity, right? There's Holofernes' foot in the back on the bed, right? And she's handing his head over to her servant to put in the bag. There's a dismembered head on the left, right? Now, interestingly, a lot of things. First, Giulio Campagnola was a printmaker who was part of the Mantegna shop, went on to work around the circle of Giorgione after that. And this may be by him, but it certainly is very similar to Mantegna's work. You can see the striations in the rocks down below that we've seen in other works, how he loves to chop off geometrically the landscape for his setting. His hard-edged linearity to the, I would presume to be linen robe, white robe that she's wearing underneath. The way in which the folds fall across her body. Her basis in ancient Roman art. You can guess that she's probably based on any number of different images of Venus, statues of Venus. I think I have some details to show you. Right? At the same time, her face is not quite as well rendered as some other Mantegna's, and this is what keeps people guessing. You'll notice, however, that she looks rather unconcerned with what she's just done. Right? She had to do it, right? But she doesn't look at all grossed out or even fiercely determined. She seems rather unaffected by it all, expressionless face, even though she is still carrying the bloody and broken sword. There's an inscription on that sword, which I only recently saw, and I can't read it. I don't think, in one of the prints, it's Mantegna's signature on the sword, which I think is kind of cool, because he's cutting the print, right, with a printmaker's tool, right, with a burin. And the idea that he might sign on the sword, which would have also been cut with a burin, is kind of fascinating. He's really very savvy this way. Let's see what's coming up here. There's our gory detail of Holofernes' head. Again, the way he tucks the light in around the nose and the eyelids and the cheeks so that it ends up within that lost profile, sort of preserving that edge. I like how he uses the red of the servant's robe to sort of heighten the emotional impact of the scene. The neck, for having been just cut off, is not bleeding all that much, right? Looks a little drained out, if you will, like after my dad shot an elk when I was a kid out in the garage for a couple weeks, and the blood was all gone, and that's sort of the same thing here. But again, that sense of being unaffected by the horrific act, we see sort of all over the place in Renaissance art. And I should have brought something in. It's just dawning on me. Well, maybe I'll pop it up later. I don't want to bother to try to pull it up because I had troubles with this before. What's coming up next? Mantegna is this quasi-archaeologist. I don't think that's legible Persian script, but it certainly evokes the idea, right? And it continues across to give this setting something else. And I'll talk about this as if it were Mantegna, even though we're not 100% sure. He's certainly got a hand in it somewhere, either the design or the control of the project, right? It's also worth noting that this is a very, very luxurious work. It's marbleized on the back, which means it was meant as a luxury object of sorts. In other words, it's not meant to be stuck on the wall like it is at the National Gallery in frame, but it was meant to be held and looked at. And again, it's not only like yay, right? So it's a sort of a nifty little luxury object. And in addition to the marbleizing on the back, the bedpost beneath Holofernes' foot is actual real gold leaf on the highlights there. And her robe, the bits that look kind of yellow, is the highlights on her robe, is actually silver leaf, right? So there are these luxury materials that have been brought into the composition as well to make it more than just a picture of something, but an object in itself, right? That has this beauty and luxury in and of itself. Here is a Venus Felix type, the Venus of Fortune. A Roman work. Yeah, we were talking about that just a second ago. This is how I knew about it. Right? This is in Rome. Actually, this is in the Vatican. And you can see that for Mantegna, certain similarities. Look at the placement of the feet, but it's not exact, is it? Still, the way she twists in front of her body, right, with one arm, he's manipulated that to fit the posed hand, right? The other arm that was up in the Roman work is now down to hold the sword, right? And Mantegna is never slavish in his use of Roman prototypes. He's very good about sort of manipulating them, letting you know when you look at it that, oh yeah, there's got to be something Roman back there somewhere. But it's never a direct quote, right? And it's always these sort of subtle manipulations into the work he's dealing with it at that moment. And playing with it just enough that it has that imprint of being classical, right, being antique, but at the same time is original. Right? That's a tough thing to pull off. Amanda. Yeah. Indeed. And I think Mantegna's more than just looking at these things, right? I mean, he's looking at them, but he's studying them. He's really enamored with them. More so than most artists. This is a bit late in his career, right? He dies in 1506. This is very late in his career. He's born around 1430 or so. Right? 1430, because he's 18 when he starts his independent career. So 76 when he dies. And this is relatively late, last decade or so of his career, right? But throughout his career, we find him to be one of the artists who, at a very early point, around 1450, has become deeply interested in classical Roman sculpture. And he's really on the vanguard of that. And he's on the vanguard in particular of incorporating them into Roman scenes, which we'll see later today. The kinds of Roman scenes that they did as well. Right? This then leads us into this idea of Mantegna running this larger shop. So here's a painting of almost the same composition. You can see there's a servant, looks significantly more Persian, given its sort of a European's idea of what otherness is all about with the features. But there's, again, the broken sword of Holofernes, the lone foot in the shadows in the background, the decorated post on the corner of the bed, and the placement of the head into the bag of the servant, but even the tent hanging in. This is not just a faded slide. This was painted in shades of gray. So in many ways, it's a tour de force, and in the same way that the National Gallery picture is, with its additions of gold leaf and silver leaf, and marbleizing on the back side. But here the marbleizing is on the other side of the tent, and it looks almost as if Mantegna is trying to paint as if it were sculpture. Right? He's really trying to make it look like it's a low-relief sculpture. Which brings us to a kind of a big issue. I'll get you in a second, right? But this is throughout the 15th century and into the 16th century, in Italy in particular, there was a long-standing debate between painters on one hand and sculptors on the other as to which of these two artistic pursuits was more noble and more realistic, right? Because the majority of your sculptors didn't paint, and the majority of your painters didn't sculpt, right? Now, Michelangelo's the odd man out, right? Having excelled at both. But for the norm, there was the painters over here and the sculptors over here, and they belonged to different trade guilds, right? Those guilds dominated life, and they had this ongoing argument about which was better, painting or sculpture. The term that they use for this is in literature all the time, and it comes up on the big slide, is the paragone. Paragon, right? The question between the two of them. Which is better, sculpture or painting? Right? The painter says we've got color, we've got landscape, right? Setting. Sculptor says we have two dimensions, right? We made a figure that looks like the figure that it came from, right? You walk around. Painter says, yeah, but you don't dirty. And the sculptor says, yeah, but you're just, you're not really into it as much, right? So the idea that Mantegna is here, and this is come up later in the painting, this is where sculpture first ties into this idea of paragone, right? This ongoing, and it's not the same like this. Each other is like that. Understood, right? That one is better than the other, right? And it's something we see all the time. So when Donatello, we looked at the Donatello relief on Friday, when he makes these relief sculptures that look very pictorial, look as if there's three-dimensional space, that's entering into the paragone between painters and sculptors. Okay? And in the 16th century, the biggest proponents of this argument were Leonardo for painting and Michelangelo for sculpture. And they hated each other, right? And they really got into it in this way. So Mantegna, I brought these in because Mantegna's circle of artists And the circle really begins to develop to something large when he's in Mantua, working for the court, because he's got all these court commissions, right? He's going to need extra artists there. It really blossoms out to be a good half dozen people working with Mantegna as the head of this workshop. So take themes and rework them and move things around ever so slightly. It's almost as if that's a reverse of this or vice versa, right? And what we'll look at for the rest of our discussion of Mantegna will be the engravings that came out of Mantegna's shop. Artist's prints. Now, do you guys know about engravings? Right? They're like etchings, but different. So, with an engraving, I'll briefly go over this, right? You've got your diaries marked in rock. You've got a plate of metal. Let's see if you can get it. There, it goes really slow, right? You've got a plate of metal that's right, not that one. Okay. So your plate of metal is usually like about, 1/8 of an inch, then maybe 1/4 inch, maybe copper. Soft metal, right? Copper or lead. But more often than not, copper. And what you would do with the copper plate, you would take a very sharp instrument called a burr that has sort of a diamond-shaped tip. Right? And with that diamond-shaped tip, and this is sort of an angle, so my drawing's not so good. Right? Okay. With the diamond-shaped tip, you would hit that surface and carve out little pieces of metal. And those metal pieces you carve out make the lines that we're looking at here, right? So you hit this plate, you carve a little V-shaped line. If you saw it all the way to the edge, you have these little V-shaped lines that go through it, right? Like that. For each of the black lines you see here, right? And what you do when you carve the plate is you rub ink all over the surface, down into the lines, but over the slab as well. And then you slowly polish it with the heel of your hand. And as you rub the heel of your hand across those lines that you carved, the ink stays in the lines and you polish off the top. Right? Polish off the flat. You then take that, put a piece of paper on top of it, and run it through a press with a significant amount of pressure. So you have a couple of wheels. Again, this is not cooperating so well. With a bed underneath, your little etching plate will go here with ink on it, a piece of paper on it, and as it rolls through here, there'll be some padding on it, right? It will press the paper down, and it will go inside those inside lines, pull the ink. That means that once you carve your plate, you can run off multiple prints from that plate, right? The problem is that the pressure that you need in order to make this work means that if you make this, blow this up bigger, right? If this is now our etching plate with our cut line, you would never cut this. Okay? So what it means is that every time that roller goes over the top of it, a little bit of this starts to wear over. Right? Because you're running metal against metal, right? Not really just padding, but like anything, right? You're just going to slowly but surely polish it out, right? And eventually through time, you're going to get to the point where the line might look sort of like that, right? Which means it's not going to hold a hell of a lot of ink, right? Whereas before you had a nice big column of ink right there, right? Now you're getting a little column of ink down here, which means you want to take dark lines, start to grade it in, right? Grade it out. So if we look now, this is a Mantegna design that's been engraved by a member of this group, Gerolamo Modesta. Now all the lines that you're seeing here, right? And he doesn't do much cross-section, primarily single action, right? One direction. Although Lincoln Spirit does some cross-section. And then comes over the top with the lines that take up, the fold. You can see that almost everything is a single patch. A single residual here. They're holding a good amount of ink yet. But eventually they would grade out through use. And what we find is, this would help came into possession of those plates might go back and actually recarve them. You see this all the time with it. Drill string collecting, you get a whole later recarve on the beautiful shell. Like this little line on it, you get nitrous. They're not nitrous. Those ones are not nearly as well valued. Okay? So, Mantegna's running his printmaking shop, and part of it is that he's going to be selling works of art that are his designs, and some of them he may well carve himself. There's some debate on that, right? Because there was a professional class of plate carvers that he could have used. But he comes up with some of the most amazing engravings from all of the 15th century, anywhere. Second, really, only to some Germans who were the first rate, right? So here we see the first of these prints from the Circle of Mantegna, where we're going to find that many of these prints take themes that he had worked up in paintings and reworked them in the same way that he reworked ancient sculpture into something slightly different. So too, his prints aren't simple reproductions of a given painting, but they bear great similarity to those paintings, right? And rework those ideas. So a painting can only be for one person in one place, right? We saw the San Zeno altarpiece in Verona. That's still in the church it was commissioned to go in, and only just the people can see it, the ones there. But if you can make engravings that are inspired by some of those compositions, then everybody can see them, right? And there was, in fact, a whole class of print collectors that he's really targeting with these, right? And this technology is not very high tech, right? And by the way, it's hard. I have a printmaking degree. It is hard. It is really hard work to drive a burin through the metal. You just cut yourself all the time. You're bleeding constantly. Because that you slip, I think you're right in your fingertips, you know. So you feel like you're diabetic, you know, taking your because you just end up with these holes in your hands everywhere you look. And also it doesn't respond, right? It's metal on metal. It's not like a pen. Right? And they're just absolutely beautiful. And so they get this silvery quality. And I think what I was going to say that I forgot about when I was up there is that the darker lines are deeper, right? That's kind of how the engraving process works. If you want a very thin, light line, you cut a very shallow line. If you want a very deep, heavy, velvety line, you cut deeper, right? And so the tone that we see comes from that. Okay? It's the exact opposite of woodcut, because with woodcut you roll the ink on the top of the plane, and it doesn't go into the valleys that you carve. Here, you're rubbing the ink into the valleys and pulling it out. So with woodcut, it would be much more difficult, because with woodcut you would carve away all of this, all the white, and you would leave then the lines of the details. And here, it works the same way as a pen drawing does. You don't work in reverse, right? I guess, right, if you do a great paper drawing where you come back in and erase out, that works more kind of like a woodcut. Whereas, yeah. That's right. Although with woodcut, it's a matter about how wide that is, not how thick it is. It's how wide the breadth is. So here, this one is probably carved by Mantegna. Like I said, there's a lot of debate on this, but they're fairly large. You can even see this has been folded in the center, right? There's a fold line that runs down the center. And the theme here is Christ, being dropped into the tomb, about to be lowered from the cross, which we see in the back, so they're carrying him away from that and going to place him into the tomb. We assume that the rock behind them is the opening to the tomb itself, right? And you can see behind the head of the central figure with the banner that kind of goes off in the wind. It looks as if the cave opens up that direction. But there's also a tomb down below which says the Redemptor of mankind, right? The Savior of mankind in Latin. We know from Mantegna's biographies and people that wrote about him in the 15th century that he actually went out and as an amateur archaeologist, he went out and actually studied Roman inscriptions started to write the script in the way that he had seen it on Roman monuments. And so the script that we see here is actually accurate Roman script, right? Again, it's just down to that kind of loving detail, right? And in fact, the same script we see on other prints by Mantegna that say other things that reflect the degree to which he's been studying. It's a fairly large impression, as I said. It's about 15 or so inches across, which you can imagine even the technical thing of having to smooth out a copper plate that thin, right? It's got to be polished smooth to start with. Otherwise, if it's not, if there's any wrinkles in that copper plate, that's going to hold ink as well, right? It's got to be sort of mirror smooth to start with. So it's really amazing, the scale of this. And he's really taking advantage of the entire thing. We have this frieze of figures, very large figures, that takes up almost the entirety of the composition. But at the same time, the spaces between them are then filled with other details. And you can see as we look back to Calvary and the three crosses back there, we have that same kind of landscape that we saw with Mantegna's paintings. Almost like frozen lava, right, where it's come down in these striations. And that's true even on that little hillock, here in the middle of that, right? Sort of looks like layers of things. Dare I say it almost looks like scat. It almost looks like dung, a cow pile or something like that in the field. But even elsewhere, you can see how kind of cubic his construction of the rocks behind the figures are. And as you look at this, you have to imagine this is bigger than some of the paintings we've seen, right? Like that. And so on one hand, with the print, you want to get up close and stick your nose in and see the details. But on the other hand, he's also giving us this sort of broad panoramic sweep. Even though it's dominated by figures, there's this sort of halves of the composition. You've got this guy in the center who's got the feet of Christ right above that tomb. And his body leans to the left, but he looks back to his right. So he really unites these two halves of the composition, right? The half that has the body of Christ in the foreground on the left, and the other half, St. John and the Virgin Mary on the right, that are mourning the passing of Christ. And it's all brought together by this figure in the middle who looks one way, moves the opposite way, and that helps for you, the viewer, right, to work your way through the composition. So it's really quite terrific. I've got some nice details because the Nationality makes good pictures available. Notice again the diagonal hatching that we see in this. It's not cross-hatching per se, but diagonal hatching, and they tend to overlay. So if he's hatching this, right, standard cross-hatching would be where you would come in with a series of lines one direction, and then the other lines the other direction, right? But what Mantegna does is it comes with his lines, and then if he wants to darken it, let's just sort of come over it at a very, very slight angle. So that we end up with this sort of feathery quality, right, that you can see in this detail. This happens real quickly. And sometimes, and I don't know how he did this, right? Sometimes the lines do this. They make this series of sort of V shapes. And he looks at them closely, and I don't know how he's doing it. That means he's coming in, either making them meet or turning that gearing around and pushing it back the other direction. Right? They're really technically just profound, right? And you can see down here some of those lines that I'm talking about. They get a little V shape. And then even the folds of this figure, probably Joseph of Arimathea, right? So there's kind of beginning with these diagonal curves that are everywhere. They give this really wonderful sort of upper right, lower left, seven, right, for lack of a better word, across the figures. Again, he's also focusing very much on the different reactions of Christ's followers to his passing, and giving us this full range of trauma from that wonderful figure St. John on the far right, who's gripping his hands and screaming out loud, through the sort of noble dignity of Joseph of Arimathea here. But the figure directly behind him, more racked by trauma and covering his eyes as he wipes the tears away. For you, the viewer, it's very obvious that Mantegna has turned the body so we can see the wounds of Christ on his proper right hand and his proper right foot, and in fact, I believe in his side as well, so that we too can ponder the body of Christ and figure out which one of these figures we want to react like. Okay. There's a group on the left, Nicodemus holding the head of Christ, probably Mary Magdalene behind with her hands up like that. In fact, I can trace that pose back to 14th century paintings in my mind. And again, Mantegna's really reference heavy, right, bringing various works in. But the Magdalene almost always presents to us viewers an alternative way of reacting to the Virgin Mary. We have these two different Marys who are at the tomb, and the Mary Magdalene, because of her past, of the fact that she was once a prostitute, tends to be more extroverted in her reactions, whereas the Virgin Mary tends to be more introverted in hers. And so in this particular respect, we see the Mary Magdalene's hair flying out, right? Letting your hair down was seen as a sign of wantonness, right? Bad choices. And then the Virgin Mary on the right, on the ground, who just fainted dead away, is exactly the opposite of her shape and form, right? Her hair is bound up inside, and whereas the Magdalene is centrifugal, right, just exploding outward, the Virgin Mary is centrifugal. Centripetal, I get it wrong. But anyway, imploding, right? Exploding versus imploding, that's probably easier to say, right? And here's a detail of her there being comforted by the figures behind her. This image of the Virgin Mary fainting away we can find actually in some of Mantegna's pictures, but again, never an exact quote, again, being remanipulated into the different compositions. Right? Now, like I said, there is some question as to whether or not he carved even the best of the seven. There's seven or so that are usually given to him. But there's a really very strong debate as to whether or not he actually carved the plates or hired a professional engraver, which may well have been the case. But I kind of like the idea that he did it. Yeah.
How do we know that this is Mary, Virgin Mary as well? You can see hair.
You can see hair, but you can also see that around her head there still is, she's the one that always sings. We know it's her simply because she's singing. And the reason for that is something that we find in theological writings throughout the Middle Ages, that as Christ suffered his death on the cross, the Virgin Mary's reaction was to have this could sound bad, but a little death. French death, little death means something else. But she suffered something like unto death, right? By fainting. And we see this in many images, most poignantly beginning in the 15th century, but earlier as well, where her compassion for her son makes her suffer in the same way his passion, right? So Christ's passion gives the Virgin compassion, right? So simply because she's the one that faints in a way, we know she's the Virgin Mary. And as to how much hair is there, yes, there's some coming out, you're absolutely right, it's there. But at the same time, it's been covered up, and maybe there's even some connection.
Does see this part like hair as well? I don't see that as part of the head.
Yeah, you're exactly right. But it's nowhere near what the manual is. It's not lining out the side.
And the clothing is different from the Mary by Jesus as well. It doesn't have that embroidery on the cuff and neck, and the waistband is different as well. So
right. It's just there's no doubt that.
I know that hair is are two things in one.
Oh, I see. You're right. It's supposed to be one in one cut. But that's not the case. The pose of the Magdalene is traditional for poses of the Magdalene. And this pose of the Virgin Mary is right in keeping with many, many images of the Virgin Mary in other ways. And the fact that she has embroidery on her chest, we saw that for wounds in Fabiana, where often she has embroidery on her clothing along the hems that usually says something. Now keep in mind that this is engraved in, and also keep in mind that everything's done backwards, right? You know how the print process works. On the plate, it's going to be the exact opposite of what we see. Because when you peel it off, it's the other way around, which means he's doing the strokes are going, really, as he's putting on the plate, they're going this direction, right? And then when he prints it, it comes up looking the opposite. And the letters that you see are all in mirror on the plate itself. I don't think any of Mantegna's plates survive, right? But as we look at images by Mantegna's prints on paper, what we'll see is that different impressions look different because of where they were in the lifespan of the plate. And furthermore, certain images look different because they've been handled so much and trimmed around the edges, right up until the museum got it, as much as they possibly can to get rid of the dirty bits, right? So sometimes you can see the marks that's left by the plate because the paper will be bigger than the plate. We look back at one of the drawings here, right? The plate on the edge here, well, actually this will catch some ink. And so if we have enough paper over the edge that's not been trimmed, I believe you can see what's called the face mark. And that won't suggest how big the plate was, but sometimes through use and abuse, right, and then being trimmed up or pieces just simply falling off and being handled, we end up losing the edge of the plate mark, right? So here we can't see the plate mark anywhere, right? And you can see where the edges of the plate are here and here. So I think one thing will be another shape here. Diamond right there. This one here, the little diamond there. Can you see those? That's very, very fine. Another one there. Right? And this one like this. We think that these might have been to register the actual drawing. So what Mantegna would have done was to do the drawing first and transfer the drawing. And those little corner marks might have been there so that as he's tracing it over onto the plate, he slips a little bit, he gets in line with that one. Right, and get the drawing transferred. And then he can really work it up after that, right? So this is sort of a little remnant of that. He could have polished it out, and he didn't. This is just a guess. We don't know for sure. Like I said, big shop. In this case, somebody did a plate after the original, and you can see they just basically took a print and carved it into the new plate, and then when they printed it, it came out reversed with everything except for the inscription, right? So this is, again, from the Mantegna shop and borrows from the composition, almost, line for line. It's almost to size, but at the same time is nowhere near so elegant as this, but again, coming out of his shop. Yeah, on the left. On the left of the one on the the two guys in the center, right? With their backs to each other now, and the two prints, right? This is going here. And he's almost always this one male, again, going back to traditional days. When we see a man near the Virgin Mary, at the moment he thinks it's almost exactly the John. Right? This is just more. And if you look at the pictures, there's really no doubt that it would be anybody else except that. In the same way that a woman with her hands raised, looks wonderful, like hallelujah, except for her face. It has to be the Virgin. It has to be Mary Magdalene. This is a really fantastic print. Here he is after the resurrection, right? So we see him going into the tomb, now he's coming back out again. But it's an odd image in that it's not telling a story in the same way as the entombment print. It's more kind of like an icon. He's just sort of standing there as the risen Christ. It's not an image of the resurrection, right? Because at the resurrection, there are the guards sleeping around the tomb. And you'll notice that Mantegna gives us absolutely nothing in the way of a setting for this, except for the tomb behind him. And then the two figures that are there are not figures that were there at the moment of the resurrection. So on the right is St. Longinus. You know who he is? He's the centurion who helped torture Christ on the cross. So if you remember you know these sources, right? On the cross, Christ suffered a number of different wounds. So leading up to being put on the cross, he received the crown of thorns, and scars the hell out of him. Right? And then he's nailed to the cross in his hands and feet. And in the images, you almost always see it here, although more likely the probably realistically here because it's right out because there's no cross I'll go into it. But the 5 principal wounds are 2 feet, 2 hands. And then while he's dying, at one point they attempt to see if he's still alive by piercing his side with one of the Roman soldiers piercing his side with a sword away. Right? And the Bible says very little about this literally, right, verbatim in the text. But through the Middle Ages, this soldier who pierced Christ's side was given a name, Longinus, and was given a bit of a backstory, a legend. And according to the legend, Longinus was blind at the moment he did. He was blind centurion. They had to actually have somebody helping, do this. And after having done this, some of Christ's blood that's coming from his son fell on Longinus, right? Dripped down on Longinus, and hit him in the face and went to wipe it off. And as he did, he got the blood on his eyes, and he was miraculously healed of his blindness. And immediately converted to Christianity. Now I can see that this is the Savior, right? And evil metaphorically, right? So that's Longinus dressed as a Roman centurion, right? And you'll notice Mantegna's interest in archaeology. Look at that great top, right? And he's carrying his sword as he prays to Christ. And he's not there at the moment of the resurrection, according to the story. He's there for other reasons. One of the apostles on the left, Andrew, right? Who is also not there at the moment. I love how, as a composition, what Mantegna has done here is he's made the eye level at the very, very bottom of the print, so that the platform that they're standing on, right? We think of this as the platform they're standing on. We're above it. Our eyesight is above it, right? We're down on the flat of that. Whereas here, we don't see the top of what they're standing on. It receives away from us down, so we're actually lower. It puts you, right, as if you're down most of the ground. But you get the idea, right? That your eye level is about here, right? So the prince are going to be pulled up and you look up at you, right? As he towers overhead. Now, it's not that big, it's not that big, right? But it's wonderful conception of being sort of elevated above you because he's a risen Christ. And again, I've got some wonderful details. We have the original drawing. This is actual size, right? So this is the drawing that he made. It's in, I think, Munich or Paris. I forget exactly where. So it's the drawing that he made to transfer it to here. And the way he would transfer it then is to turn it upside down and rub it from the back, right? And that way it would be the same way around when it's printed, right? And you can see that he's really tucked the dark around Christ in certain elements. But it is a line-for-line drawing. Right? You can also see in both of these, there's that long staff with the cross on top, in this case with the banner as well, that we saw with the infant Christ by Mantegna in the National Gallery. That's that symbol of his resurrection. Right? Andrew carries the cross. Right? Really great little touches, right? Look at Andrew's foot coming over the edge of that lip into your space, right? Really gives it an incredibly strong three-dimensional quality. There's an inscription. Can you see this down below in the drawing? Pious and immortal God, Pio et immortali Deo. And it wasn't originally put on the print or ever put in later, which is kind of fascinating because it's obviously that looks like there's a place for it, doesn't it? Right? That really looks like it's begging for an inscription of it, right? And he originally planned to do one, but he never got around to it. And it's kind of a fascinating thing in itself. A lot of Mantegna's earliest prints, 1465, he starts to sort of experiment with printmaking, aren't finished. He does 3 or 4 before he finally starts to finish them. Right? And so one wonders here if he's still not really sure about this, even though it's a really great print, right? You can also see, I think, in this one, as clear as anyone that we've seen, how he builds up those single directional hatches to make up the various tones that we see. In this detail, we can see even better, and even some of those zigzags I was talking about. Look at here, right? There's a cutback, right, on those lines. now we've got multiple lines that sort of run almost parallel to each other. Almost, right? And keep in mind that none is cutting them. And then look at this wonderful shaping on the musculature, right? And again, each one of them has the big end here, and starts heavy and then ends light. That's probably the way he does that, right? And then he'll bend it that way he has to, where he gets this great linear, hard-edged rendering of Christ's face, which gives it a terrific expression too, right? Almost as if, and look at looking down, and keep in mind where your eye level is on this. And it's sort of like, why did you do this? Because the point of resurrection is that Christ died for our sins. We wouldn't have had to go through all of that if we weren't such icky people, And so there's something about his face that is just once, lordly, regal, pitying, but also sort of just like, I don't want to say condescending because I don't want to sound all unbiased about that, right? But these are great object lessons in drapery, aren't they? Look at how the edge of the drapery is handled and how he's figured out how to make the drapery swirl by giving us this series of marks here. On the right is Longinus, which we've already talked about, and shows certainly his interest in Roman archaeology by giving us a very accurate Roman costume. Again, remember that these are done while Mantegna is in Padua, and that would account for why these two people are here with Christ. How do we account? Because he made this choice, right? St. Andrew and Longinus are not there at the moment of resurrection in the Bible. So what the heck are they doing there here, right? And if we look at the context where Mantegna made this print, it makes perfect sense. That he's included them for a reason, that they would have had a resonance for an audience in Mantua, where he had moved. According to legend, right, St. Longinus had brought to Mantua a relic of Christ's blood, which is still housed in the cathedral. You can go see it in the cathedral. And he donated it to Mantua, and it sat in the church of St. Andrew, San Andrea. Right? So Andrew, Christ who has shed the blood, and Longinus who brought the blood to the church of St. Andrew. Right? These are here for the devotion of someone from Mantua who would have had that special knowledge, and would have put this all together immediately. Oh, there's the namesake of the church where the blood is housed, and there's the guy who brought that blood there. Right? It's all part of it. And I love the internet. There it is. Those are the reliquaries that hold. Those are not 15th century ones. Those are only 17th. But still, inside those crystals are the remnants of Christ's blood that are housed in the cathedral in Mantua. Look inside the glass crystals on each one of them. Yeah. I imagine it's this little dark bit right in there, right? There's a lot of relics of Christ's blood floating around. I don't know exactly how long they've had it, but like I said, according to local legend, Longinus had brought it there, so they'd had it for a very, very long time. So the church is brand new, though, and that gives us a date for the print, right? The church was, you can see there was an old church here. The bell tower on the left is significantly older. That's a good 11th century bell tower, probably 12th. But the main body of the church is, in fact, brand new and was built by Alberti, who wrote the book on how to do perspective. He wrote a book called How to Paint, on painting, Della Pittura, and was a very prominent architect in Florence. And in this case, has gone to Mantua. And exactly the same time Mantegna is there. So this building is going up during those 10 years that Mantegna is first living in Mantua. And so his print is really copying in, if you will, cashing in on a new phase of Mantuan history and a new phase of devotion in Mantua. A new church dedicated to St. Andrew, still holding this ancient relic of the blood of Christ. that had been brought there by St. Longinus. Okay. I should also mention, and this is, I think, kind of important, is that the figure of Christ, and this is the best I could do, originally over the doorway here was a fresco in a round bell that showed the risen Christ surrounded by angels. Very badly damaged, it's moved inside the church. That's the only picture I can find. Right? So you'll notice the pose is exactly the pose from our current. So again, he's giving us another way in which this thing pulled into the devotional context around this particular church. And the devotions particularly to the holy blood of Christ. Right? And when you saw the holy blood of Christ, in most cities when you got a chance to see it, especially if you got to see it on Good Friday, you would get indulgences up the wazoo, right? Usually complete plenary indulgences. That means every sin is wiped clean if you're in the proper attitude, right? If you're not snarky, like your professor. Yeah. The church or the church? I don't know. Like I said, that's the best picture I could find of it, so part of me thinks that's about as good as we're going to get, right? Insofar as it. But again, maybe this will be my next big trip to Italy. I'll also go to Mantua and check these things out. So I would love to see this stuff. Right? Another Mantegna work, again, more debate on this. Is this by Mantegna or by his shop? One of the primary printmakers that was working for him was a man named Zolan and Andrea. Zolan is the Venetian dialect. Giovanni or John, right? It takes a Z in the Venetian dialect. So Zolan Andrea, you mentioned John Andrew, right? And it was Mantegna's primary printmaker in the 70s and 80s, one of the sort of the heavy hitters in his printmaking shop. They got into a big argument in the 1490s because Zolan Andrea wanted out of the Mantegna shop, and Mantegna said, fine, but the plates are mine, even though Zolan Andrea had carved them, right? And so, no, they're mine, and Mantegna confiscated them because it didn't matter who carved them, it mattered who designed them, right? They were products of the Mantegna shop. So anyway, there's some debate on this. Is it by Mantegna? Is it by Zolan Andrea? And again, it shows us another scene from the sort of same sequencing, if you will. We saw Christ being lowered into the tomb. Here we see the resurrected Christ. Well, here's what happens in between. Right? Between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, Christ descends into hell and sets those who died under the state of law rather than the state of grace, those who died before salvation, sets them free. Right? So it's Christ in the center with his back to us. It's rather kind of a poignant, dramatic thing, right? Descending into hell, and our eyes follow him as he goes into hell. And there in the darkness, you see just one hint of a body down there. But he has knocked down the gates. He's trampling them under his foot. This is not really discussed heavily in the Bible, but it's part of the Apostles' Creed that he went into limbo to set the captives free. Again, he has that same staff with a banner as a symbol of his victory over death. I love those demons, up above, trumpeting what's about to happen as Christ is freeing the captives from their torment by these demons. Again, very Mantegna-esque in the handling of the landscape and the rock formations with those sort of cubic construction of the rocks, or the cutaway of the landscape down below. The figure on the left, holding a cross, looking very much like St. Andrew, isn't he? On the left. This is, by all accounts, the good thief. Christ was crucified between two thieves. And in the Bible, he tells one of them, confesses and turns his heart over to Christ, and Christ says, today you will be with me in paradise. And so he often appears in images of Christ descending into limbo because he's following him around, right? Going into limbo, following him to the resurrection, end up in paradise with Christ. So that's the good thief there, right? The bad thief never repents. The bad thief's always on Christ's left. That's the bad side. So here is the good thief holding his cross and looking up above to these demons. The figures on the right are almost certainly Adam and Eve, and my guess is probably Abel, right? Their son Abel, because Cain ain't going to make it out, right? He murdered, right? Adam and Eve disobeyed, but they'll be saved as well. But you'll notice that they're old, right? Eve almost looks like an old hag with sagging breasts, but still in a very standard Eve pose, which is kind of based on Venus, where she's covering up her nudity. And the fellow with his back to us, you'll notice the similarity of poses here, right? See how Christ is sort of huddled over, this arm down like this, and moving in. And Adam has exactly the same pose, at least from the torso up. And that ties back to the way in which theologians often talk about what happened with these two figures, both created by God, right? A nation, right? Christ is born of a virgin, through the intervention of God. Adam formed from the earth through the intervention of God, right? Adam, created by God, brings about mankind. Christ, created by God, brings about our salvation. So in many ways, he's the new Adam. And that's what we find theologians talking about him often as Christ is the new Adam. Mary is the new Eve. That what was originally led to sin now leads to salvation. Right? Now, Cain is picking up on that, isn't he? Visually. By paralleling that torso pose of both Christ with his resurrection banner and Adam and Eve. This is Christ, the new Adam, come to undo the trouble that the first couple had brought. Very, very quickly, there were a couple of prototypes that Mantegna would have known for this scene, and you can see that here he's picking up on these ideas, but again, like what he does with English world and art, he never does it directly. He never does it as a slave or spoke, but tweaks it around, manipulates it, reworks it for his own purposes. So here's a drawing from Bellini's sketchbook, tropical Bellini sketchbook. You read it, right? There's the descent of the limbo. Notice the demons floating around the doorway, going back behind the rock. There's the good thief on the left with his cross. That's probably the closest parallel, isn't it? Right? There's Christ going in. He's actually grabbing Adam by the hand. In this case, it's his old man, right? Pulling him out. But you'll notice he's stepping on the door. Mantegna has gotten rid of, you see this all the time, the demon underneath the door, right? He's gotten rid of that. You don't see that as much. But he's also going to play with it to give us this poignancy, right, into the tomb from our space, so that our eyes follow him, right? We get to go with him and see how he saved everybody. Remember that Jacopo Bellini was Mantegna's father-in-law, right? He married Jacopo Bellini's daughter. So it's likely that he would have known the sketchbook itself. There was also, this is part of the della of an altarpiece in Padua by Jacopo Bellini. Remember the work from the National Gallery of Jacopo, the two saints, right? St. Anthony and St. Bernardino. This is from the same altar, from the della Jacopo Bellini. And there's, based on his sketchbook, very much the same proposition. There's Christ moving in, like Stigmata, right? Getting Adam first, there's Eve directly behind him, there's the good people on that. So this is a prototype that Mantegna was certainly known. And you can see the degree in which he's ramped up the drama. He really did a much more effective and really very modern composition of this, right? Sorry, I cut you 3 minutes late. We're almost done with Mantegna. I've got a few more to show you. There's some wonderful, fully classical scenes that we should look at first. So I think on Friday we'll start off with those, then we'll dive into the Bellini reading, right? So be sure to bring a copy of the Bellini reading with you on Friday so that we can, in fact, discuss it. And again, your response for that on Friday, but the revision of the first response on Monday. Yeah, I kind of want to write it after we discuss it because I want to do someone. So ideally before class, right?